Hello, thanks for downloading the brushes. This video's a quick introduction to everything that's in the set, and I'll also explain the way I use them in my painting process. Brushes fall into three broad categories as far as I'm concerned. That's texture brushes, effects brushes and painting brushes. There are examples of all three in this set, so I'll run you through each in turn, starting with the texture brushes here. I use these to block in large areas of a canvas. So my main criteria for these is that they paint quickly. You don't want to be waiting around for Photoshop to fill in the brushes as you're eager to start on your masterpiece. And that they fill a large area with an interesting looking texture. So let's have a look at the stroke this produces. I mean, you wouldn't really use these, or at least I don't really use these, to make strokes. It's much more, as you've just seen, a case of slowly building up an area of texture. Now each of these texture brushes arrives in a pair. So there's a second one in the same family here, if you like. Now the reason for that is, if I just go back and create a gradient with this first one, when you do fill in a large area like this, you can start to see the texture repeating a little bit. It depends, particularly if I dig in, and you can see more of the brush shape. You can just start to see that repetition kicking in. So if you fill with a second brush as well, one with a similar texture, it will help to break that up. I mean, none of these brushes is going to provide a texture that you're going to want to leave in a final finish painting, but the idea is to provide you something that you can work into. And obviously it's helpful if there's no repetition there. So that's the first set. Let me just quickly show you what you get out of the second one with a stroke. This one's a bit softer than the first. There's the first one again. It's got a bit more grit to it, but they work quite nicely together. On to the second one. This is much softer, as you can see, and you can build up a much smoother gradient with this if necessary. And once again you can see that it's starting to repeat a little bit. Again, there's a brother or sister brush which you can use just to break things up a little bit. There's a slight watercolour quality to this one. These are all brushes I've made myself. I can't remember how this one started life. I think it was spilt coffee, which I scanned in and made into a brush tip. Go back to the first one again. These are quite useful, these soft ones. If you use the blend tool at all, you can use these soft brushes that are quite nicely spaced out like this, quite nicely with the blend tool. It will blend but not super smooth in the way that the soft round brush would. Next one, so we've got a heavier texture this time. Again, it can be used to build up a gradient, but as you can see, it's much heavier with a more recognisable texture, which means a more recognisable repeat as well. More useful for just hitting specific areas. And again, it's got a brother of the same style that you can use to try and get rid of that repetition. I mean, everybody uses these brushes differently. I use these big brushes, as I said before, for blocking in really, and not a great deal else. Occasionally, if there's a large area that needs texturing, I'll just quickly run over it with one of these brushes, but then I'm back to the painting brush and just working into what's being put down with the big brush. Here's the next one. This is sponge. We're starting to straddle the boundary between a texture brush and an effects brush here. It's much more recognisable as a brush, I think, when it's got such an obvious texture in it. It's quite a big tip, this though, so the repetition isn't quite such a problem. Though once again, there's a second brush that you can use just to work in and break any repetition that you are seeing up. With all of these organic brushes, they're a great sort of starting point for placing foliage maybe, or undergrowth, any kind of organic shapes. And there's a third brush in that little set there, which is also sponge, but very dry sponge. Now this I would class as an effects brush, but it can also be used just to add a bit of detail to the texture you've put down with the texture brushes there. So that's that effect brush on its own. Really useful just for adding a little bit of grit and interest. And if you work over and over, it will slowly build up into a solid colour. Next we've got a spatter brush. It's quite a broad spatter, this. Again, useful for just touching in certain areas. I quite often use a brush like this to touch in dark, so kind of a broad shading effect. It's more interesting than using an airbrush type effect. Obviously it allows some of what you've already painted to show through and adds that texture on top. So that can be used to stroke and shade as well if required. Next one is, it's a coarser spatter, but it's a more predictable stroke, as you can see. It's not got quite the spread on it as the other one. Useful for adding more defined, controlled areas of texture. Again, you can build it up as much as you want to. Then we've got this chap, which I used to use a lot, but I don't use all that often these days. It's great. It looks like there's been a lot of brushwork when there hasn't really been very much brushwork at all. It's a broken dry brush effect, and you can use it, as you see, to build up areas of heavy texture if you so wish, or just to touch over the top. This works much better against other paint marks rather than on a blank canvas like this. But as with all of them, how you absorb them into your own workflow is going to be a very personal thing indeed. Next is this chap, quite a bold effect brush, this one, but useful for adding chunky texture where you need it. She's a good one to use to block in trees. Doesn't take long at all for you to create a little copse or a spinny there. You can even use it to place a few bushes maybe. If you can hear the keyboard clacking away in the background, it's because I'm changing the shape of the brush using the keyboard. I'll talk briefly how the brushes are set through when I get to the painting brushes. Next is this dry brush fellow. Again, this is useful for adding brush strokes where there aren't any, or lots of brush strokes where there are only few. It's not that practical for painting really, but for adding texture and effects, which is what it's for, very useful. This one's a favourite for adding sparks and magic effects. Paint the basic effect and then just throw some of those around the edge. It's quite effective. And obviously all of these can work at different sizes. You can build them up. Firework type effects. Sparks, as I said before. Hours of fun. And finally for the texture brushes is this fellow, which I still use a lot. It's a useful soft texturing brush. Particularly for backgrounds, you can use this to, when there's already some painting down, you can use it to temper what you've done as a kind of a broad shading effect quite nicely. You get quite a nice stroke out of it as well, and it's semi-transparent. I'm not sure if you can tell that I'm still using the black there, but you've got to really work at it to get it to fill in a solid colour. So, as I said, for working over stuff, it's really handy. Okay, now we're into the useful stuff, the painting brushes. These are the things, personally, 95% plus of the painting is done with very simple opaque brushes. And the way these are set up, just as the other brushes were, is with the pen pressure controlling opacity only. The size is controlled manually from the keyboard. Obviously you can jigger about with the effects and the settings on these brushes to your heart's content, but that's the way I use it. So first in line is a pencil. I'm going to try that again because that's a really poor cursive C. So's that. What's wrong with me? Let's try capitals. Much better. There we go. I must draw less and write more. This is a useful brush. It's great for fast sketching. You don't need textures. You can get a nice big interesting line very quickly. And you've got a good texture there if you want to scribble away and shade. Very useful. You can also size him up a bit and get a bit of texture going on, though it's a small brush tip, so if you get too big it's going to be very soft and full of artifacts. Then painting brushes. These are the brushes, as I said, that I use for the majority of stuff. I'll quickly run through these individually so you can see the difference. It's quite subtle, but I'll zoom in so you can see how the edges are different. That first one is a round brush with a fairly solid profile. As you can see, now a square brush. It feels a bit more opaque. This one's broken and a little drier. This one's a directional brush. And this last one is a kind of a softer broken brush. So just zoom in a little bit, you can see how different they are. That's the first one. You get a solid colour, but a nice broken, irregular edge to the mark there. So as you work over, it builds up quite nicely to create texture as you work. The next one is the square brush. That's the same, very opaque, but with a less broken edge, so it's a bit more predictable. Better for hard surfaces. The broken brush, I use this a lot. This has got a slightly softer edge because you've got a few hairs, essentially, brush hairs, kicking out around the edge. As you work over, it gets a much softer kind of a profile. Now the directional brush, this is set up so that the initial direction here controls the angle that the brush is drawn at. So whether I go diagonally, vertically, I get the same slightly broken mark. That's great for texturing up hair, fur, that kind of thing, and for filling in large areas with interesting brush textures. And lastly, this one doesn't get a lot of use because it's fairly specific, is the soft broken brush. So it's kind of a combination of the two previous ones, a soft edge but with more of a an interesting brushy profile. Again, that's a good one that's useful for hair. A useful blending brush as well. There we go. That's the basics, but we're not done there. Also included in the download is a set of textures. Now I use these all the time, and it transforms all the other brushes into something completely different. So if we just look at the painting brush to begin with, going to texture there, the way I've got it set up, scale is 100%, and the mode is set to colour burn. Now you can see the profile there in the preview at the bottom in Photoshop's brush window. What I was going for when I set these brushes up was a natural media sort of feel. So colour burn, I mean, you can see there's lots of different ways to apply this texture. Play around, find the one that works best for you. But for me, it's colour burn. Whoops, not linear burn, colour burn. The reason being, when I press on hard, I get an opaque stroke. There's no texture in there at all. When I press on softly, just a little bit of the texture comes through. And as I press on harder, it's as if the paint is pushing itself into the cracks of that texture until it eventually becomes opaque. Now that's how I'm used to paint behaving on a painting surface, whether it's a textured board or just on top of other paint. So that feels right to me, and it feels interesting. So there's a selection of different, let's move that, whoops, let's move that upstairs so we can see, there we go. The selection of different textures here, and I'll just quickly run through them all. Perhaps not all of them, I'll run through some of them so you can see how they work. This is the grunge texture. Now, with all of these painting brushes, what I like to do is place colour I want very specifically, like that, with a nice hard stroke, and then work out of it with a backwards and forwards, kind of a scumble effect. Or I suppose it's similar to how you might work with pencil crayons. And that means that you get quite a lot of this texture coming through. And as that layers up, if I just quickly put some greys into it there, it builds up over time quite nicely. These textures are quite small. I think they're about 256 pixels square. They're seamless, but you will see the repeat if you use them over a large area. If you look at any of my work, you'll see that the texture is very, very, very small indeed. Most of the texture is coming from the brush marks and not from this texture thing. So I'm not having to worry too much about the repeat. So It's about finding one which is comfortable with you and suits the application. These textures are fairly easy to use and to paint with, and they'll just add a little bit of interest to the marks you're making. Something like this heavy spatter changes the quality of a brush completely. You still get the heavy mark at the end, but because the texture is so high contrast, it really stands out. There's some natural surfaces in here as well, like this tree bark. Whether you use it as bark or not is another thing. It could just as easily be the sole of a goblin's foot, or the inside of an orc's elbow. It really doesn't matter. Again, like the texture brushes and the effects brushes before, you can just engage these just to tickle around in a particular area of the piece you're working on, just to add a little bit of extra interest. Let's go for just a couple more. This one works quite nicely. Just to show you how they work with a different brush. The more broken the brush, the more obvious the texture will be. None of these brushes are set up to work with texture by default. You'll have to click the texture on. So as the strokes are of different weights, so different amounts of texture come through. So you can see that builds up quite nicely as you work away. And you can of course use those textures with the texture brushes as well. So if we take the soft brush without the texture, you get an effect like that. If you want to work the texture in just very lightly, there we go, very subtle. And as you can see, it completely changes the character of the brush. You can see the repetition coming in there, but if that was worked over an existing passage of a painting, it could be very handy. Same with all the others. If we go for one of the heavier textures, so without the texture it looks like that. With a texture you get an effect more like that. So the two textures are kind of working together. The brush has its own shape and it's pushing against the texture underneath. Photoshop's brush engine is very simple, but used right it can be very, very powerful. The most interesting of these textures to use on the big one would be the heavy spatter. That's really going to change the way things work. There we go. So the textures you should find in, if I just open load patterns here, your operating system and version of Photoshop may very well be different, but Adobe Photoshop presets down to patterns, that's where the textures live, and then Matt Dixon Essential Textures.pat, that's the file you want. And for the brushes, let me just go back, same thing, into presets, brushes, and it's Matt Dixon Essentials. I hope they're useful. If you enjoy the brushes, please rate them and leave a comment. Of course, you can follow my exploits on Twitter, Facebook and everywhere else. Thanks again for downloading. Have fun.